School districts across the country use disciplinary policies that push students out of the classroom and into the criminal justice system. The impact of these policies is called the school-to-prison pipeline. 92,000 students were arrested during the 2011 to 2012 school year. 75% of those cases were misdemeanors. It is impossible to talk about the school-to-prison pipeline without addressing what communities are disproportionately at risk. LGBTQ+ students, students of color, and students with disabilities are at an immediate disadvantage in the U.S. public school system, and therefore they are at the highest risk of entering the criminal justice system. We must ask, what are these disciplinary policies and why do they impact disadvantaged students the most?
Let's take it back. In the 1970s, pushing students out of school was relatively rare, with less than 4% of students receiving suspensions. That changed in 1994 with the passage of the Gun-Free Schools Act. It mandated suspension and expulsion practices for any student caught bringing a weapon to school. It increased the police presence on school campuses drastically across the country. This policy has been cited as the beginning of zero-tolerance practices in schools across the country. It has been widely criticized as the definition of a weapon was expanded to punish students for making guns with their fingers or chewing a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. Zero-tolerance policies allow for police officers in schools to decide who is and is not a threat to school safety, which in turn makes communities who are historically criminalized at risk of these push-out trends. The Gun-Free Schools Act is certainly not the only culprit in looking at the development of the school-to-prison pipeline. At the same time as zero-tolerance policies for violence were introduced, school districts created many different versions of the broken windows theory of policing. The broken windows theory is the importance of cracking down on minor offenses to make residents feel safer because it discourages more serious crimes. In schools, the theory translated to cracking down on talking back to teachers, disobedience, and skipping class.
Studies have demonstrated that the school-to-prison pipeline does not start in kindergarten at public schools. In fact, it doesn't even start in preschool or child care facilities. The pipeline for a student commences at birth, and for the most part is founded off of the color of the child's skin and the socioeconomic class of the baby's parents. Cuyahoga County law states that students are considered to be an habitual truant if they miss 30 or more unexcused consecutive hours, 42 or more unexcused hours in a school month, or 72 or more unexcused hours in a school year. In 25 states plus D.C., juveniles can go to jail for truancy, and more than 50% of juveniles charged with truancy are subject to recidivism. Parents with a child who is convicted of truancy are also subject to prison time. They can be convicted of failure to provide adequate support or non-support of dependents. Parents and children can be charged with high fines or over 180 days in prison if the truancy conviction is held. Students charged with truancy are disproportionately from low-income and minority communities. The Department of Education hasn't given students in low-income and minority communities the support they need to catch up to or demonstrate proficiency in their grade levels. In many public schools, instead of holding students back who have failed to reach proficiency in reading and math, the students are simply pushed on to the next grade level. Even in high school, there are students who cannot do basic algebra or read and write. The EPI found that these students were most likely to miss school and be charged with truancy.
To end the school-to-prison pipeline, we must look at the quality of education in communities at the highest risk. In Ohio, education spending is based on each individual district's property tax revenue, meaning that districts with more expensive properties have better funded schools and districts with less expensive properties get less funding. Orange, Ohio has an average property value of $310,000 and spends over $20,000 per student annually. Garfield Heights, on the other hand, has a median property value of $70,000 and spends on average $10,000 per student annually, meaning Garfield Heights students get half as much funding as students in Orange, Ohio. And Garfield Heights students are 3 times as likely to face suspension and expulsion than the state average. In the United States, the amount of money you can afford to spend on your home should never dictate the quality of education you receive and your likelihood of entering the criminal justice system.
We need to call upon local leaders of education in Ohio, and specifically Cuyahoga County leaders, to understand the effects of zero-tolerance policies on the school-to-prison pipeline and take action by including greater funding of public schools. Paulo De Maria, the superintendent of the Ohio Board of Education, needs to address the effects zero-tolerance has on the school-to-prison pipeline, as well as addressing the outrageous amount of truancy cases that come through the Cuyahoga courts each year. Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor of the Ohio Juvenile Supreme Court needs to limit the amount of truancy case convictions going through her court each year. It is of utmost importance for our state and country as a whole to succeed through education, and this can only happen in a classroom. This allows the students the chance to become something more in life rather than falling victim to the school-to-prison pipeline by being pushed out due to policy standards and regulations.
Zakiya, a young African-American mother from Ross County whose son was kicked out of 3 public schools for what teachers called violent disruptive behavior, explains, "I suddenly realized that I wasn't a bad parent and my son wasn't abnormal. This was something larger, more societal that was happening to African-American parents." The voices of parents like Zakiya telling their stories and advocating for themselves creates a passionate and powerful force for calling for change in U.S. public schools. To end the school-to-prison pipeline, we must all advocate for more equitable education spending, and we must hold local leaders accountable for their support of zero-tolerance policies in school that perpetually push students out of schools and into the criminal justice system.